Hello everyone, my name is Stelios Georgiades, and I will be the first presenter for this session. I am based at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, but as you might notice from my accent, I am of Greek descent, and I'm still jet lagged, so I might switch between Greek and English along the way, so bear with me. So today I'm going to talk to you about a program of research that focuses on understanding the phenotypic mostly, but also the biological heterogeneity that we see in autism spectrum disorders. And I'm going to start by my disclosure slide. And this is one of the main messages that I want you to take with you today. Okay, so the overview of my presentation, I'm going to provide some background, very brief background on autism spectrum disorder. I'm going to describe to you why heterogeneity in ASD is in fact a big issue, both in terms of research, but mostly in terms of clinical practice. I'm going to talk a little bit about a longitudinal study that we have in Canada called the Pathways in ASD study, and then share some of the findings from the Pathways study that we believe inform our understanding of heterogeneity in autism. And I'm going to end by proposing a shift in our research paradigm where instead of approaching heterogeneity as a challenge, we will potentially be able to use it as informative variants in our understanding of autism. And finally, I'm going to introduce a new study that we have recently started in Canada that uses this new research paradigm for heterogeneity as we move forward. Okay, so some of you might know that the term autism was coined by Leo Kanner back in 1943. Whenever I go back to this original paper, which by the way is online and everyone can access it, I realize that despite the significant progress that we've made, especially in understanding the biological components associated with autism, this original description of the disorder by Leo Kanner remains until now the foundation of what we know and how we view this disorder. In his opening paragraph, Leo Kanner notes, "There have come to our attention a number of children whose condition differs so markedly and uniquely from anything reported so far that each case merits, and I hope will eventually receive, a detailed consideration of its fascinating peculiarities." So even in the opening paragraph of Leo Kanner's original paper on autism, he hints strongly, I think, about the heterogeneity of this disorder. So autism spectrum disorder, as you might know, is quite prevalent neurodevelopmental disorder. The latest prevalence rates from the CDC in the US are 1 in 68. It is usually diagnosed in early childhood, and it is characterized at the diagnosis level by two main deficits in social communication and in patterns of repetitive restricted behaviors. We also know that children and individuals with autism have multiple associated comorbidities, both mental and physical. And despite the fact that specific treatments can help with specific symptoms or problem behaviors, I would argue that we still have no major treatment that can significantly change long-term outcomes in autism. Now, back in 2010, there was a piece in the Washington Times, and a quote from that piece has been picked up by the media and is frequently used. And that quote is, "If you have seen one child with autism, you have seen one child with autism." Well, of course, parents and clinicians have known this for years, but it's now in the Times, published, so we can use it. So the bottom line here is that ASD is a remarkably heterogeneous disorder. But when we say heterogeneity, it's important for us to have a kind of a common understanding of what we mean by that. Heterogeneity denotes diversity of variability, but it's not only that. It describes dissimilar parts, variable parts, that are somehow connected. So this idea that all individuals with ASD are part of this spectrum, they have different profiles, and I will talk about the different profiles in a while, but they're somehow connected in the underlying mechanisms. And we know that ASD is linked to deficits in patterns of cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and social functioning, but we also know that these are manifested differently across individuals, and we now know, instead of searching for the autism gene, which was the case 10, 15 years ago, we now know that we have multiple ideological factors, and in the case of genetics, we have at least 100 genes that have been shown to be at least associated with autism. So as it stands right now, heterogeneity presents a major challenge in our understanding of the disorder in terms of etiology, diagnosis, treatment, but also prognosis. So now I'm going to turn to our longitudinal study, the Pathways study in Canada. This is the largest longitudinal investigation in ASD. We have 420 participants, and we've been following these children over the past 10 years. From the time of diagnosis to age 12, and we are planning to continue following them into the adolescent years. We conduct multiple assessments using multiple informants across multiple domains, and I will explain what I mean in a few minutes. The sampling of the study we think is important, is a consecutive series design. So every child that has been diagnosed with autism within certain geographical regions, and you can see the 5 geographical regions across 5 provinces in Canada, is offered to participate in the study. The study uses an ecological and multi-level design. We collect information at the child level, but also the family, school, and community level. We try to explore the associations of the different variables within each level and understand how these levels interact with each other over time. And as I said, it's a developmental longitudinal design from the time of diagnosis all the way up to the school years, repeated measures, and multi-method, multi-informant. Okay, so now, as you know, in the recent revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, we have new criteria for ASD. We no longer have the different subtypes of autism, PDD-NOS, or Asperger's. There's only one type, autism spectrum disorder. It's an umbrella category. And the diagnostic criteria are organized in 2 major domains, the social communication deficits and the fixated interest and repetitive behaviors. A new addition to the diagnostic criteria is the inclusion of clinical specifiers, and it will be interesting to see how in your screening measure you're able to kind of incorporate these clinical specifiers. We can talk about that later perhaps. So now a clinician, in addition to assigning a diagnosis of ASD, can also include information about language issues, developmental functioning, type of onset, comorbid symptoms, as well as medical conditions, which is a very important development. The new criteria also include 3 severity levels, and those are to be defined based on the support required. But really, I don't know how many of you are familiar with these criteria. Basically, there is no kind of reliable and valid way of determining what those severity levels within the spectrum should be. And that's what we try to do. Using empirical data from the Pathways in ASD study, we took the entire sample at the time of diagnosis. The 2 axes represent the 2 diagnostic dimensions: social communication deficits and repetitive behaviors and interest. And as you can see, within this spectrum, there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of heterogeneity. A child who scores at the top right end of this graph is probably very different than the child that scores at the low left end of this graph. So we try to use empirical, systematic techniques, analytic techniques, to come up with different subgroups that tend to be more homogeneous in terms of given variables. It's not rocket science, but we were the first to actually do it, and we were fortunate to have the data to do it. So if you employ certain statistical techniques, you will see that within the spectrum of autism, you have three distinct, relatively distinct, because as you can see there's overlap, different subgroups or profiles of kids that differ on a number of variables, and I will explain what those are. Don't worry about this. This just describes the probability of each child to belong in one of the three subgroups. So time 1 on the left end of this graph presents the time of diagnosis. So that's what we did at time of diagnosis. But then we asked ourselves, is this heterogeneity stable over time, or does it change as children develop and receive services? So we used data from time 2, which is around the age of 6, and using similar statistical techniques, we've concluded that that heterogeneity tends to decrease as children develop. Now, of course, that can mean at least two things. A, that it actually decreases, heterogeneity decreases, or B, the tools that we're using to measure heterogeneity, which in fact are the diagnostic tools, are not equipped, are not capable of truly measuring heterogeneity as children develop. Now, this study included mostly measures related to diagnostic symptoms. But as many of you know, parents, once they get the diagnosis for their child, their first question is prognosis. What will my child be able to do? So now you explain to me what my child cannot do, and that helped the clinician assign a diagnosis, but I want to know what my child would be able to do as he or she develops. So that is referred to adaptive functioning skills in terms of communication, socialization, but also the basic daily living skills that a child needs to master in order to function independently in the home, in school, but also in society. So the question that we asked was, do diagnostic symptoms predetermine or have the power to predict the development of adaptive functioning skills over time? And I have to say that was a research question that was kind of communicated to us through our conversations with parents. So we think it has high utility for clinical practice. So using data from the pathway study, 420 preschool children, we use a technique that's called prog-traj, which basically don't let people tell you that statistics are complex. They're not. We just like to present them as complex. Basically, we grouped children over time based on their similarities. That's as simple as that. And we examined two different sets of trajectories, the diagnostic symptoms, but also the adaptive functioning skills. Now, this is a study that we've recently published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry, JAMA Psychiatry, and we're actually very proud of this paper, simply because we think it has clinical implications. And it's very important for researchers to think about clinical implications as they do their work. So if you track the developmental trajectories of these kids in terms of their diagnostic autistic symptoms, you get a very simple picture with two trajectories. The majority of kids, close to 90%, being in the top trajectory, which is the more severe and stable. But you also see a subgroup of kids, close to 12%, that has lower severity at diagnosis and then improves by age 6. So Some researchers have talked about this subgroup of kids using terms like optimal outcome. Maybe you've heard the term. But what happens if you track the trajectories of adaptive functioning? Here, things are a little bit more complicated. You get 3 trajectories with high, moderate, and kind of lower functioning. But really, the important question is on the next slide, and it tries to answer whether or not your membership in a trajectory of diagnostic autistic symptoms is linked to your membership in a trajectory of adaptive functioning. And as you can see from this graph, which is a little bit complicated to explain, but I will walk you through it, the answer is not always. So I want you to pay close attention to the 2 red circles at the far end of the graph. That's the more severe and stable group in terms of autistic symptoms. So even within the subgroup of kids who have severe autistic symptoms, 20% of them are in the higher adaptive functioning and improving trajectory. And about 48% of them are in the moderate functioning trajectory. So what do these results mean in general? So along the heterogeneous autism spectrum, there appear to be distinct, relatively homogeneous subgroups of children, and on average, these children differ in terms of symptom severity, adaptive skills, and emotional behavioral problems. We've shown that the underlying structure of the autism symptom phenotype changes as children grow and develop. Perhaps more importantly, we've demonstrated that heterogeneity differs across domains over time. So change in one domain does not necessarily mean change in another domain. So this idea of high versus low functioning kids with autism, we believe is just too simplistic, and perhaps we need to move beyond that. So when in Athens, think as the Athenians. So we tried to question some of our kind of status quo thinking in autism. And we propose that instead of a set of categorical symptoms that remain static over the lifespan, ASD might be better understood as a dynamic disorder that is structured both on categorical, diagnostic, but also dimensional constructs that vary not only across individuals at any given point, but also within individuals over time. And we now have enough evidence to shift our research paradigm for autism, and instead of viewing heterogeneity as a major obstacle, as a major challenge, we can slowly begin to see it as an informed variance that can help us understand the etiology, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis of autism. And we propose that we should no longer approach heterogeneity as a post hoc outcome of our generic measurements, the diagnostic measurements that we use, but we should instead approach it as a conceptual and methodological framework that will lead to the development of new measures and the implementation and interpretation of new studies that are designed specifically to capture this heterogeneity not only at the phenotype clinical symptom level, but also at the genotype, and kind of make the links between the 2 different levels. Some ideas as we move forward. We believe that it's important to start sampling outside the spectrum. Just because a child does not meet the full diagnostic criteria, it does not mean that that child doesn't have challenges associated with autism. So that could inform our understanding of the disorder. We need to develop measures that capture variability. We need to start integrating data from multiple levels and domains. I think this is a key issue that probably applies to other disorders. We tend to have a lot of studies that are clinical studies. We have studies that are biological, genetic studies, but very few people actually have the capability of integrating data from different levels and making sense of those data. So there's a big role for bioinformatics here. The use of longitudinal data to understand a neurodevelopmental disorder we think is critical. The importance of studying the contextual effects, again, we think is of very high importance. Just because autism or any other disorder is viewed as a heritable or familial, some people might say genetic disorder, it doesn't mean that the effects of the environment, such as the family and the school and the services, the treatment that kids receive, should be ignored in our study. We need to test the utility of these subgroups. So we derive empirically different subgroups, different subtypes, but can these subtypes, can these subgroups be used to predict either genetic causes, response to treatment, or longitudinal and prognostic outcome? And this is exactly what we are doing with this new project. I am very pleased to say that with the support of the Ontario Brain Institute, we have received $22 million to conduct a very large, complex project called the Province of Ontario Neurodevelopmental Disorders project, where we are recruiting up to 2,000 children with neurodevelopmental disorders, not just ASD, but also ADHD, OCD, and intellectual disability. And you all know that these comorbidities are very common. So in this large project, we have sub-studies that go all the way from genomics to symptom behavior, clinical studies, the assessment of cognition, epigenetics, neuroimaging, but also randomized control trials of new, and in some cases, older therapeutics that had been used for other disorders. So the idea here is that once you have all of this multi-level information on these kids, you will then be able to go back after these kids receive treatment and apply this idea of precision or personalized medicine, if you wish, and see who are the kids who benefited from what treatments and why. So by having data on all of these levels, we're hoping to develop a treatment model that is more targeted based on the strengths and the challenges of each child, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach. This project is in line with the recent initiative by NIH. How many of you are familiar or have heard something about the RDoC, the Research Domain Criteria? No one. Okay, so that's a good thing. It means that Europe is still hanging on. So the National Institutes of Health in the US are now guiding their funding away from the DSM-focused studies. So the DSM, I think in Europe, you're using the ICD, right? So Diagnostic Manual. So the National Institute of Health are saying we are no longer interested so much in studies that focus on the DSM-like approach. We are interested in studies that focus on cross-disorder domains that can be measured and documented at multiple levels, from biology all the way to the clinical symptoms. It's a radical approach. It's a controversial approach, but that's where the funding is going. So there is no doubt that it will be the dominant research approach, at least in North America, as we move forward. Personally, I believe there is enormous value in making sure that the medical model, the DSM or ICD model, and this RDoC model that is kind of pushed from NIH come together to develop a model that kind of incorporates both the clinical piece but also the research piece that is now being promoted by NIH. And I think I'm going to end right there. These are my Canadian colleagues. As you can see, Almost none of them is tanned. We don't get a lot of sunshine in Canada, but they're a great team to work with. And I've also listed the websites for the two major studies, the Pathways study and the POND study, if you're interested in getting more information. And I just want to thank the children and families that are involved in our studies, my mentors, my collaborators, mostly my students because they are my greatest teachers, and of course the APPAC team that has done an amazing job putting this conference together. And I've also listed my email in case you want to know more about our work or if you want to exchange some ideas. I'll be more than happy to communicate with you. And of course we have to always acknowledge our multiple sponsors. Thank you so much for your attention. Any questions? Yes.
I was just wondering if there is research that shows that autism is rising at some countries more than others, because it certainly sounds as if in our societies the amount of people with autism is really rising. Yeah,
I think that's an excellent question. That obviously has very important implications. There has been kind of a push to conduct research on the prevalence rates across countries. There are a few published papers that demonstrate variability in the prevalence rates between North America and even Europe. And then if you compare those two, so the Western countries to the developing countries, you see even greater variability. But my personal opinion is that those studies are very weak methodologically, and really who gets the airtime? It's the researchers in those countries that have sufficient funds, such as the US or some of the European countries or even Canada, that have sufficient funds to do the research and document the prevalence rates. So those are the rates that we all hear about, but you know, my answer would be we simply don't have the evidence that we need to answer that question. It's definitely on the rise, and that's a different question, right? And you probably know that there are different factors that are linked to this increase in autism prevalence. But in terms of this idea of global prevalence rates, I just don't think we have the evidence to answer that. Any other questions or ideas? Ideas, yes. Okay. I'm actually more interested in ideas.
Okay, I feel that we are drawn because of all the internet. Mrs. Parmenidou mentioned it already, that we live in a society where we are drawn within ourselves and a screen. Mobile phones have created, I think, very autistic behaviors. We see people talking to themselves in the street now, and it's a normal behavior. So we are actually getting acquainted very quickly to an autistic way of life. This is my idea, and I hope.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting comment, and as Mrs. Parmenidou indicated, you know, it tends to be kind of a societal phenomenon nowadays. I am usually a very social individual, but I have to confess that technology and you know, cell phones and computers are pushing me more and more into kind of a more isolated way of life. There is no doubt about that. And you know, this is what kids are born into nowadays. This is the culture and the society that kids are faced with as soon as they're born. So this is all they know. So I think it's a very interesting idea. One of my colleagues back in Canada, who is a phenomenal child psychologist, whenever I ask him, what do you think the biggest issue will be down the road for kids, he always talks about the negative effect of technology. He notes the potential positive effect, but he's really afraid of the negative effect of technology. Yes?
On this question, this Hello. I just want to ask something, because I was also in the other conference in Larissa of the psychiatrists, and they mentioned this point, not in combination with autism especially, but the dangers of the psychological dangers of technology. And they mentioned that, which I kind of agree, that with the coming now of this, these glasses, not the glasses especially, but the big Oculus, I think, that somebody can get in, and
the virtual reality
yeah,
world.
you can actually get in and make a second life in there, and if you have the glasses, maybe somebody cannot even find a reason to get out of that reality. And I was just wondering, why do we know the dangers, and the psychological and psychiatric society know this danger. So why do we allow this to happen? Why do we allow not technology, but if we know that, for instance, these glasses can be dangerous, why does it is allowed to?
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm asking?
I think I understand your question.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not an expert in the effects of technology on child development. But a personal opinion would be that you can't really fight technology. You can't limit technology or the accessibility of technology. Usually clinicians see certain patterns of either behavior or societal effects on kids. But the rest of society does not necessarily, is not necessarily too concerned about what clinicians are saying. And that's kind of an acknowledgement, a realization that I've come to over the years. In my experience, at least in Canada, some of the strongest advocates, someone who can perhaps push for, let's say, some limits on the use of technology, would be the parents themselves, not the clinicians. And in the case of autism, the parent advocacy lobby has been very successful in many different ways. They're very well connected. They really strive for sufficient clinical services and policies for their kids. Now, the flip side of that would be that technology, including the virtual reality stuff, could be potentially used for therapeutic reasons. And I know there are a few kind of pilot studies out there that are testing the effect of this technology on virtual socialization for kids with autism. I think it's a neat idea. And the underlying idea there is that if kids can at least start socializing, and we know that socialization is the core deficit in autism, right? If they can do it in a virtual way, perhaps some of those skills can be transferable to real life. That remains to be seen, but it is a new area of research as we're moving forward. Okay, thanks again for your attention.